Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to McCormick Theological Seminary. I am Reverend Nanette Banks, Vice President for Community Engagement and Alumni Relations. This afternoon, we are delighted that you have joined us for Rioting as Flourishing, Reconsidering Virtue and Rage During Times of Civil Unrest. The content of this program is timely and relevant, with hopes of expanding the conversation as it relates to rioting, and with hopes of impacting and transforming communities. Your presence is key in fulfilling these hopes. So please take a moment and locate the Q&A function at the base of your Zoom screen. This is where you will submit your questions to be answered during the Q&A segment. We also ask that if you are on Facebook, to start a watch party that others may have the opportunity to learn alongside of you this afternoon. And if you find this program of great interest, please make sure to visit mccormick.edu to learn of other offerings that seek to transform lives and communities. This program this afternoon would not be possible without the impactful work of our panelists today. We have Dr. Sarah MacDonald, currently a consultant in the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she specializes in inclusive teaching, conflict transformation, and anti-racism in higher education. Drawing on her previous experience in nonviolent activism and international peace building, Sarah's work highlights how constructive conflict may function as a catalyst for learning and growth. Sarah holds a PhD in religion, conflict, and peace building from Emory University and an MA in English from the University of Iowa. She is also a very proud alum of McCormick Theological Seminary with a Master's of Divinity, class of 2007. We welcome you, Sarah. And we have Dr. Nicole Symmonds, a PhD candidate in ethics in Emory University's Graduate Division of Religion. Her research explores the intersection of Christian social ethics and women, gender, and sexuality, with a focus on Black women's embodied agency and images of representation within religious and secular contexts. She is currently working on her dissertation, Trafficking in God, exploring race and religion in commercial sex work intervention, which focuses on how historical and contemporary understandings of race and gender influence contemporary anti-trafficking work organized by white evangelicals. Her dissertation constructs a womanist ethic that seeks to respond to the particular needs of Black women in commercial sex work. Nicole holds a Master of Divinity in Theology and Ethics from the Candler School of Theology and a Bachelor of Science in Journalism from Florida A&M University. Welcome, Nicole. Rioting and Flourishing, Reconsidering Virtue and Rage During Times of Civil Unrest has been a passion project for this duo. And in 2016, they workshopped the first iteration of this work during our annual McCormick Days. The power it held in that moment and the palpability of it now has challenged me and many others on the way we view rioting. So be prepared. At this time, I invite Reverend Dr. Anita Crittenden to offer a centering prayer, and after that, you will hear from our esteemed panelists. Thank you again for joining us, and God bless.
Let us center ourselves as we ground ourselves for this wonderful, wonderful symposium. Let us pray. Most gracious and loving God, for the grace and mercy you've extended to all of us today, we give you thanks. We thank you, God, for being our divine source of life. We thank you for the gift of today. As we just take a moment and breathe in and breathe out, we thank you, God, for the breath of life. We thank you for wisdom that is beyond price And we thank you for Sophia. God, we thank you for this great cloud of witnesses that have gathered here today. They have come from their various spaces, but God, we have all gathered for a unified purpose. And as we gather in Zoom land and are grateful for this place and grateful for a place we call home, we pray, God, for those who have no home. So God, let us continue to welcome the foreigner, to build bridges and not walls. Grant us your peace, God, your shalom. Forgive us if we've offended any, if we have caused any harm. Let us, God, love mercy, do justice, and walk humbly with you. We pray, God, that humankind everywhere respect your earth. Let us live in harmony with Mother Earth. Let us not take more from the earth than we give. And so, God, in the midst of these troubling times, in the midst of these pandemics, give us, God, peace that passes all understanding. Help us to tell somebody that troubles don't last always. Now, God, for the kingdom assignment before us, rioting versus flourishing, what John Lewis might call good trouble. We thank you, God, that we are called to the kingdom for such a time as this. In Jesus' name, Ashe and Amen.
Thank you so much, Anita, for that wonderful centering prayer. I am really excited to be here to discuss some of the good trouble that we have been wrestling with, Sarah and I, for the last 5 years now. And thank you so much, Nanette, for the gracious introduction. And of course, thank you to McCormick Theological Seminary for opening up another opportunity for us to deal with this work, right? To explore it. We are in the midst of a very pivotal moment in our society and in our culture. So I certainly consider it not robbery to bring this work before a general audience again so that we may all learn together. So the first thing that I wanted to do was kind of orient ourselves toward the subject of rioting that we are talking about. It's sort of the centerpiece of this entire discussion regarding rioting as a mode of political resistance in conversation with virtue ethics. So we're really thinking about the ethics and efficacy of rioting and modes of political resistance to lead people toward flourishing. So if you give me a moment, we are going to transition into a brief activity. So hopefully you can see on your screen right now, you should see a full screen that's asking you to respond to a prompt. So the first thing you will need to do is visit this web address, www.menti.com, and then type in the following 6-digit code. You can either do this on your cell phone or on your computer. When you type in that URL as well as the code, you should see this prompt: what words come to mind when you hear the word riot? And you will see 3 fields with which you can enter up to 3 responses to this. So I invite you all to take a moment right now, open up your phone or another window on your computer so that you can participate in it. But make sure you also keep your eyes on this primary screen, because you are going to get to see a kind of real-time reaction to your responses in regard to the question of what words come to mind when you hear the word riot. So I invite you to engage now with that, and I'll give about 60 to 90 seconds for us to start typing in our up to 3 responses. So I hope that you can see as you all are typing those words in, we have a dynamically forming word cloud. So we are seeing how violence is springing up, chaos, anger. Keep on putting those in. If you still have the opportunity, you can only vote once, but you can put in up to 3 words. Excellent. So I think that we got a critical mass of responses there. Oh, we're still building. Okay, so if you hold tight for 1 second, we are going to do this a second time with a different word. And I see we're still moving, so I will give us a couple of more seconds. Excellent. So with that, you should see now that I've switched us to our second question, your phone either refreshed automatically because I moved to the next slide, or you might have to hit refresh on your phone. So either one of those two should get you to our current screen, and you are going to do the same exact thing that you did with the last question. So enter up to 3 responses in regard to this question of when you hear the word political resistance, what word comes to mind? Oh, I'm loving how this word cloud is building. Strength, hope for change, white people, partisanship. Oh, we even have Jesse Jackson in there. Okay, so I'm gonna give about 30 more seconds for us to fill these in, and then we are going to transition. Martin Luther King, echo chamber. I love this, and I'm excited to discuss this further when we get into Q&A. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to capture this for us, and what we will do is actually discuss the commonalities and contrasts between these 2 word clouds when we segue into the discussion portion. So again, bear with me as I transition us into our presentation. So I hope that that opening activity really got the juices flowing for us in regard to our topic for the day. So we are doing this presentation in 2 parts, and I'm going to focus on orienting us toward the riot as a mode of political resistance. So the first thing that is important for us to do with anything of this nature is kind of establish our objectives. So what I'm hoping for us to gather in this period of time is to understand and analyze the significance of rioting as a tactic of political resistance that may, right? And so may is sort of our operative word, and Sarah and I will talk a little bit more about that later, but that may pave a path toward flourishing for systemically oppressed people. So first of all, we have to determine the definition of political resistance, and that is going to frame our discussion for this half. So first of all, when we think about political resistance, One, we're wrestling with the fact that when I was doing my research for this, and I mean, we are rolling back the clock to about 5 years ago at least, it's interesting that even if you try to sort of do research now, that you are not going to find an explicit definition of political resistance. What you will find is a definition of resistance. And so that's why we have this first definition here. So this is posited by political theologian Michael Walzer, who tells us that resistance is a form of collective civil disobedience. It involves physical presence and solidarity. It appeals to moral law or human rights, and it is usually illegal, but nonviolent. It is locally and communally based. Its activists are angry citizens and lower level officials. Now, the other thing that we have to think about regarding his definition of resistance is I believe that we've all come to know that there are situations and contexts in which resistance does become violent. So it can usually be illegal, but it can also be violent. It can be legal and be nonviolent. So there are these sort of contrasts and these dichotomies and binaries, if you will, that we are trying to break, that we have to wrestle with. Now, the expansion on resistance is to add in the political, hence why at the top we kind of have political in parentheses. So political resistance is inclusive of this first definition, but it focuses on resistance established by forms of governance that are not equitable, equal, nor do they serve the common good. So political resistance is usually taken up by citizens of a nation, of a country, of a state, of a city, who begin to kind of rail against the establishment or rail against the ways in which the rules or the governance of a region do not equally and equitably, do not benefit those, nor do they serve the common good. So then we kind of drill down and we are thinking about what is the riot? So first of all, we think about the fact that many times when we hear about the riot from, a month or two ago in the height of the uprisings to a sort of history of rioting that we know generally, we understand it as a visceral manifestation of anger. Yet the problem with that is usually where people stop in regard to the riot. It is usually defined as this visceral manifestation of anger, which is why it has its critics, because people just believe that it is purely emotional. So you can form a moral argument against it because there are certainly moral philosophers and plain philosophers who might believe in the ways in which one must use their anger. And so a riot would not be the proper way. So one, we want to establish the fact that the riot is not just about a visceral manifestation of anger. It can surely include that, but it also shows up as an act of political and or economic resistance. And again, I'm pointing to, and we won't have the time to go over this because as you may well know, rioting has been taken up as a mode of political resistance for centuries almost, right? Within this context that we're thinking about right now, we can think about the fact that Jesus was driving out the money changers in the temple. And that was a riot of its own, right? And the root cause of that is because Jesus believed that the temple was being changed into this den of thieves. It was being changed into an area for profit. And so that was an act of political resistance. It is a form of protest, right? So as we saw it a couple of months ago, and it's crazy to say a couple of months ago because it certainly feels like it was last week. It is certainly a form of protest in response to a historical injustice experienced by people. And so that segues us into the fact that rioting is a strategy employed by the marginalized. And so when I talk about strategy, and I will fast forward to this, tactics, we have strategies and tactics appear, and I always get my French philosophers mixed up. So it's either Bordeaux or Desserteau, who talks about strategies, which are usually employed by people in dominant positions, versus tactics that are kind of employed by an underclass, if you will. But in this case, the riot appears as a strategy that is employed by marginalized people, right? And so these are people that are well aware of the history of rioting as it has appeared in society, in the world. But then, as we think about it, this tactic employed by instigators, I'm sure people are like, well, who are the instigators in this situation? And so it's a double-edged sword, right? The instigator can be the people who are trying to rupture this dominant view of violence. In our case, we're thinking about the violence against Black people and against Black bodies. But the instigator that I am referring to is the one that we have seen pop up in the most recent uprising, right? So it is a person who is distracting from the main goal of the riot or of this moment of political resistance, right? So the instigator is actually not on the side of the people who have taken up this moment of rioting to make their voices heard. So we have to really balance in tension the fact that there are people that take up the riot as this sort of righteous cause, and then there are people who try to distract from that, who try to further kind of cast dispersion upon the project of the riot. So with that, and I say brief history, and I realized when I made this slide, I was like, this is not going to be a brief history, because in order for us to do a brief history of the riot, we have to have way more time than we currently have. So I thought it would just be helpful, and these two images that you are looking at right now are images of the Tulsa race riot as well as the Watts race riot. So as many know, these are pretty significant riots that have happened in US history. They are both sites of riots that happen because of racial discord. They also usually involve this key figure, right? So when we think about Tulsa, we're thinking about the issue of Dick Rowland and his encounter with Sarah Page and the way in which that narrative was conflated, and then the uprising that happened out of that, right? The uprising that one caused Black people to kind of rush to the jailhouse to make sure that Rowland wasn't going to be lynched as the rumors were suggesting. But then two, what happens is that white people kind of rush to Tulsa to destroy the Greenwood district, right? To destroy Black Wall Street. This becomes one of the biggest race riots that we have seen to date. Then we move to Watts. So Watts is August 11th. It's actually within the span of 5 days in 1965. And so we have a similar situation where Marquette Frye is pulled over by the police and a dispute occurs, and word catches a fire in the community that the police violated not only a Black woman, but a woman with child. And so that makes the city sort of burst into fire, and it makes people react. And this is sort of the ground that we're thinking about when we hear Martin Luther King's words, which we will hear right now, assuming technology agrees with us. So there we sit with the words that have become kind of synonymous with the riot, right? Every single time that a riot pops up in the consciousness of the United States and really anywhere across the world, but for our context, where you're thinking about North America, we always hear people rush quickly to say Dr. King's words. And so he says, I think we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America's failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the economic plight of the Negro has worsened over the last few years. And shortly after that, he talks about the fact that it is going to be a hot summer and we are going to continuously see this. Then we fast forward to 50 years even. So when Sarah and I originally did this presentation in 2017, I believe it was, at the time that I pulled this quote, it was almost 50 years to the day when Dr. King said this, that Reverend Dr. William Barber would follow up and talk about the riots that happened in Charlotte. And so he says that the riots in Charlotte are the predictable response of human beings who are drowning in systemic injustice. We must all pray that no one else gets hurt, but we must understand why this is happening. So I then frame this to bring us back to these images of the riot, right? Dr. King talked about the fact that we were going to go through some hot summers. And so after Dr. King and before Dr. William Barber's statement, at least for this LA riots, so this is the image of the riots that happened as a result of the Rodney King situation. So we have the LA riots here, we have Ferguson as a consequence of Michael Brown. And then the bottom here, we have the one that is most etched in our consciousness because we just passed it, right? In a lot of ways, the smoke is still kind of settling in the city of Minneapolis. So we have Minnesota because of George Floyd. And again, all of these riots all have the similar root cause of injustice that systemically oppressed people have experienced, right? So these are people continually not being heard, and so they must continue to use this mode of political resistance. So as we're following these debates on the riot, I noticed that we have three positions, or really we probably have at least three positions, but for brevity's sake, we have three, and because I am at least adjacent to Christian communities and I love alliteration, they all start with the letter D. So we have the riot as a distraction. So when many people are talking about the riot in the public sphere, they're talking about the fact that people are sort of just running to grab things, right? This is a material grab, this is a cash flow grab, this is people using it as an opportunity, right? Distraction becomes an opportunity to capitalize in some way. So the riot gets framed as a distraction that's used by people not to address the issue that is going on, but to sort of gain something. Then we have the riot as disruption. So on the side of those who take up this mode of resistance to make themselves heard, the riot appears as disrupting the dominant culture, right? It's disrupting police forces, it's disrupting law enforcement, governing enforcement. It is claiming itself as a position that says, we require that we are heard, we will not be silenced anymore. And then there's the riot as out and out destruction, which I think is probably one of the most popular arguments. And this is actually the question that frames that notion of destruction. Whose community is being destroyed? And so we see time and time again, especially as we were all reflecting on the riots in Minnesota, that many people would respond, why would you destroy your community? These people are destroying their community. And so the question that one must ask is not only whose community is being destroyed, but how do you define community in the first place? And I think that that's a significant question because of the detractors of the riot who say that people are destroying their communities, they are defining community as the CVS, the Wendy's, the Target, These are people that are destroying these edifices, these buildings, these signs of capitalism that particularly Black people are supposed to look at, cherish, and worship. In a lot of ways, it's meant that we are supposed to worship at the throne of capitalism, and therefore we are not supposed to destroy it, because these are good things put in our community for our flourishing. Yet, the reason why it's being destroyed in the first place is because it is not sufficient. It is not enough to secure our livelihood as people. It may symbolize a good, but it is not a good for the community, right? It doesn't give us access to the necessities that we as a people need. And so when we talk about whose community is being destroyed, we have to be really careful to understand what is community and what is the good of community. And so Sarah is actually going to talk a little bit more of that notion of good, what is required for flourishing. And so I want to sort of end this portion of our time with this quote from the book Riots and Rebellion, which says, "No other occupational group in our society has a more sustained opportunity to interpret and create understanding of the increasingly complex and deepening racial crisis in America. Thus, their understanding of and reactions to the rioting take on considerable significance." And so this is a call to action for all of us. Our responses to rioting matter, particularly if we are troubling ourselves and, in the name of good trouble. We are thinking not about destroying communities or why they are burning things, but we are thinking about the root cause of why a riot even has to happen, right? We are understanding right now that there are calls to defund and abolish the police. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that one of my hopes is that we can abolish rioting, but we cannot abolish that mode of political resistance as long as there's a sort of rioting and ravaging of the Black body that is taking place at the hands of people of authority. And so this is all in the service of orienting ourselves toward why our responses matter. And Sarah is going to take it away for us to think about the second half of this equation.
Thank you. I also want to add my thanks to McCormick Theological Seminary and the Reverend Annette Banks for this gracious invitation to Nicole and myself to repeat our work from a few years ago and engage you all again in conversation. And Nicole, thank you for that wonderful re-examination of rioting. Give me just a moment to do my technical transition and start sharing my PowerPoint slides. Okay, great. So Nicole, in the final moments of her portion of the webinar today, was talking about community and raising the question of whose community is it and what is the good? And I want to pick up from this point by starting with this question: what constitutes a good life? And I'm also going to invite some audience participation. I'm going to ask you all to use the Zoom chat window. So just to be clear, please make sure it's chat, not the Q&A. But if you type into the chat, then I and everyone else will be able to see that. So just some short responses, your ideas about what constitutes a good life. I'm interested to hear ways that you all might respond to this question. So I see freedom from oppression, basic needs being met without struggle, enough, food, security, health, love, safety, freedom, health, good for all, adequate and respectful food, clothing, shelter, sufficiency in food, basic resource, meaningful work. Flourishing, growth. Thank you. These are wonderful responses. And reflective of the various facets that go into making up a good life. This question of what constitutes a good life is a question that is very much at the heart of the field of ethics. And within the field of ethics, we might think about the good life as being good in a couple of ways. On the one hand, a good life is characterized by health and happiness, fulfillment. Some of you mentioned access to resources, meaningful work. This is all part of what we might call living well. And at the same time, another element to the good life as it is understood in the field of ethics is also doing good, practicing virtue. Traditionally, virtue has been perceived as inextricably related to human flourishing. Ideally, a virtuous life should be a flourishing life. You can't really flourish without practicing virtue. That is what Aristotle would have said, for example. But Aristotle, in his discussion of human flourishing, was also clear that virtue alone was not sufficient for someone to have a life that we could consider flourishing, a fully good life. Aristotle recognized there are a number of favorable external conditions that are also necessary for a flourishing life. So such as social freedoms, material resources, sufficient leisure time, avoiding accidents or misfortune. There are a lot of ways in which life needs to go well for you to flourish. And this raises a question for me that I want to put before us now. How do the systemic injustices of anti-Black racism disrupt flourishing? The answer to this question might seem fairly obvious. Again, remember that list of favorable external conditions. And now let's think about the conditions that exist for Black people in the midst of anti-Black racism. From chattel slavery, through segregation, through mass incarceration, conditions of voting disenfranchisement, wealth and income gaps, health disparities, violence from police and from white vigilantes. This is just a short list, the things I initially thought of off the top of my head. We could compile a much longer list. But even this brief list of the conditions of anti-Black racism are enough to make clear how utterly opposing this list is to those favorable external conditions. This is the denial of freedom, the denial of access to needed resources. It is a life of likely accidents and misfortune. So that's clearly ways in which anti-Black racism disrupts flourishing. But I think there's another answer to this question. Recall again, I'll remind you of this slide. Notice what sits at the top of that list of favorable external conditions. And that leads me to another question. How might the concept of virtue itself get wielded as a tool of anti-Black racism, as a tool that is disrupting the flourishing of Black communities. This has to do with the ways that the concept of virtue and the language of virtue often get used. If you move in circles of nonviolent activists, social justice activists, others who are working for liberation, you likely won't encounter a lot of discussion of virtue. In part because the language of virtue tends to focus our attention on individual character and behavior. And it has the potential to obscure these underlying realities of systemic oppressions. But in addition to that, even more than that, the traits and behaviors that get valued as virtuous in dominant society often are those that serve to maintain rather than challenge the status quo. So traits such as respectability, as obedience, as deference to authorities. And for these reasons, there are some liberationist scholars who respond by rejecting the field of virtue ethics altogether and developing their ethics in a completely different path. But there are other scholars and ethicists in particular who take a different approach and instead are doing the work to reconceptualize virtue in culturally specific ways. Katie Cannon is one of my favorite examples of such a scholar. Cannon was a pioneer in the field of womanist Christian ethics, and she has written very explicitly about how for the Black community, traditional ethical boundaries in mainstream Protestant simply are inadequate. The ways virtue gets talked about traditionally in Protestantism do not apply readily or helpfully to Black communities. She writes in her book, Katie's Canon, Womanism in the Soul of the Black Community, she writes, racism, gender discrimination, and economic exploitation require the Black community to create and cultivate values and virtues in their own terms, in ways that are specific and fit their own particular life circumstances. In her own scholarship, Cannon has modeled doing some of this creating and cultivating values and virtues in her own terms, kind of redefining what counts as virtuous living. In this same book, Katie's Canon, she has an essay called Unctuousness as Virtue, in which she talks about unctuousness as a character trait that can encourage resistance through crafty, slippery forms of dissent. And when we think about unctuousness, it may not seem like a virtue initially, especially to those of us who haven't been targeted by racism, those of us white people like myself, who haven't needed to develop such ways of coping or surviving. But Cannon, I think, helpfully opens up the possibilities of how we can be thinking about virtue. In this essay, she writes, creatively straining against the external restraints of one's life is virtuous living. There are other womanist and Black feminist ethicists who have been doing similar work to reframe what it means to be a good person, to exercise moral responsibility in the midst of anti-Black racism. And I want to share briefly with you just a couple of examples of this. First, Black feminist Christian ethicist Tracy West has published a book called Disruptive Christian Ethics When Racism and Women's Lives Matter. And just in the title alone, you can hear how West is encouraging us to do Christian ethics in a way that is about being disruptive, even being troublesome to those in power. Another example from womanist ethicist Emily Towns. A few years ago, she started talking about what she calls faithful colored orneriness, which Towns glosses as when folk are difficult to deal with and control, especially in the midst of a fiendish status quo. I first heard Towns speaking about colored orneriness and speaking about it as a form of moral responsibility in November of 2016. So this was part of the way she responded to conditions that were unfolding with the presidential election of 2016 and that we have seen since then. So these are just a few quick examples of some ways of reimagining and re-articulating what it means to live in ways that are ethical, faithful, life-giving in the midst of systemic oppressions. And I think this kind of reconceptualizing of virtue offers us some fresh lenses for evaluating the act of rioting when that rioting is in response to systemic racism, when it is, as Nicole has explained for us, being practiced as an act of political resistance. I want for a moment to return to the question I have already been asking: how does virtue, or the concept, the language of virtue, get wielded as a tool of anti-Black racism? And I want to add in another layer here and say, and a tool of white privilege. We can't think well about racism without also thinking about white privilege, which is the flip side of racism. These two systems work in concert with each other. And those of us who are white need to recognize how much our own positioning in a racist society and the favorable external conditions that we may be enjoying, how much all of that is coming at the expense of our Black brothers and sisters. And so as I've been preparing for this webinar, I've been sitting with this question about how virtue relates to white privilege, how it relates to me specifically as a white woman. As a white woman, my life in a lot of public narratives, my life has gotten coded or framed as valuable, also as vulnerable, as needing protection, and oftentimes as virtuous. But this is a virtuousness that is focused on innocence, on purity. These are tropes that have been powerfully in place for centuries. and they work their way out in everyday life, in interactions. And I want to take a look at a way that we've seen this happen recently. An incident that happened a few months ago that, again, I've been sitting with and reflecting on a lot as I've prepared for this webinar. You may recognize the people in these photos. This is an incident that occurred in New York Central Park on May 25th. Christian Cooper, who is an African-American man and an avid bird watcher, was out in the park to do some bird watching. He encountered a white woman named Amy Cooper and asked her to put her dog on a leash. Not only did Ms. Cooper refuse to do so, but she also escalated the situation. She started calling 911 and asking for the police to come, saying on the phone that an African-American man was threatening her. Mr. Cooper, Christian Cooper, caught this on video, posted it, it went viral, this got a lot of attention. And Amy Cooper has been roundly condemned for her actions. There's been attention to the potentially very serious and dangerous to Christian Cooper, the potential dangerous results that her 911 call could have had, and to kind of underscoring that potential danger. This was occurring on May 25th, just hours before George Floyd, another Black man, was murdered by police in Minneapolis. And so you likely have heard about this and have seen some of the responses on social media, official responses as well. More recently, the Manhattan DA has charged Amy Cooper with filing a false police report. So as I said, she has received some significant condemnation, damage to her reputation, loss of job. I'm very interested in Christian Cooper's response to the case that the DA has just filed, the charges the DA has just filed. He has declined to aid that investigation. And I want to share with you a quote from, he wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post. It was just printed yesterday, and I was reading it recently. And interested in this piece, he's raising concerns about the dangers of focusing just on one individual, in this case, this white woman. And among other things, he writes, focusing on charging Amy Cooper lets white people off the hook. They can scream for her head while leaving their own prejudices unexamined. They can push for her prosecution and pat themselves on the back for having done something about racism when they've actually done nothing. And their own Amy Cooper remains only one purse clutch in the presence of a Black man away. So he is urging us, don't fall into the trap of just focusing on one individual. Pay attention to the larger systemic oppressions that are at play here. In this case, police brutality and abuses that are in the police system, present in a systematic way. And again, I've been thinking about this story, thinking about this whole question of rioting as flourishing, and in relation to my own position as a white woman, asking myself, so what does this historical moment ask of me? What does virtue, genuine moral goodness, genuine Christian faithfulness, what does this ask of me? I believe it asks me to do the kind of personal examination that Cooper is calling for in his op-ed. I also think it asks me to think carefully about how I understand what it means to be a good person. It's not enough to simply refrain from engaging in an overtly racist action, such as calling 911 in order to escalate a situation, to place another fellow citizen in danger. It's not enough to just avoid actions like that and then go around patting myself on the back, feeling like I'm a good person. True goodness calls us to see and analyze structural racism, such as police brutality directed against Black men and the Black community more broadly. It calls us to get outraged, to get angry, and not just angry at another individual who's behaved badly, but to get angry at these systems, to forcefully and creatively resist. Perhaps to behave in ways, certainly to behave in ways that are disruptive, that are troublesome, that may be ornery, that may be likely not perceived as respectable, that certainly are not reinforcing the status quo. It calls us to behave in ways that may get us perceived as dangerous or criminal. I want to add one more layer into this conversation as we are thinking and rethinking about not only virtue, but also rage. For this, I want to draw in the work of another scholar, Carol Anderson. Dr. Anderson is a historian, a professor of African American Studies at Emory University. And in 2014, in response to the rioting that was happening in Ferguson, in reaction to the killing of Michael Brown, Carol Anderson wrote also a Washington Post op-ed called "Ferguson Isn't About Black Rage Against Cops, It's White Rage Against Progress." And then she developed that op-ed into a book called White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. This was published in 2017. And in this book, she offers a detailed examination of how white rage has played out and shaped US history. She's making an argument that when rioting is happening, the dominant narrative often focuses a lot on Black rage. And she says, no, we need to understand the ways that white rage has already been active, resisting any moments of Black emancipation or advancement. And sorry, let me skip ahead to a slide, the quote that I really want to share with you. She writes, "The trigger for white rage inevitably is Black advancement. It is not the mere presence of Black people that is the problem. Rather, it is Blackness with ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, and with demands for full and equal citizenship. It is Blackness that refuses to accept subjugation, to give up. A formidable array of policy assaults and legal contortions has consistently punished Black resilience, Black resolve. And all the while, white rage manages to maintain not only the upper hand, but also apparently the moral high ground. And in her book, White Rage, Anderson moves through history from the period of Reconstruction immediately following the Civil War, emancipation, all the way up to the election of Barack Obama as the first Black president. And she looks at key moments of Black emancipation, the Black community reaching for greater economic opportunity, fighting for civil rights. And in every one of these moments, she details how the white response is one of rage and backlash and working through political means, legal means, and civil means in order to roll back these advances, in order to try to prevent what she says here, Black resilience, Black resolve, and we could add Black flourishing. It is an important book to read and a hard book to read. She ends it by saying, you know, imagine what would US history look like and where would we be right now if the response had been different? And this is where I want to leave us asking, okay, for those of us who are white, what kinds of responses will be genuinely virtuous, that will genuinely promote the flourishing of all of us? And again, I want to close with one more picture. This photograph is from a protest that was occurring in Louisville on May 28th. This was a protest of the killing of Breonna Taylor and a call for charges to be filed against the police who shot her literally as she was sleeping in her apartment in the middle of the night. And this was part of a Black Lives Matter protest. In the midst of that protest, one of the lead organizers called out to white protesters who were there, saying, if you're going to be here, then defend the space, and asked them to line up and form a barrier between the police and Black protesters. And so this is a photograph of them doing that. And again, this photo has been shared widely. It went viral on social media. And so I want to close with this offering of, this is one possibility of a differing kind of response that again may be driven, should be driven by anger at injustice and at a desire for change, for liberation, for a wider flourishing. So my final slide, and then I'll move us into a time of question and answer. As Nicole and I have been in conversation, one of the questions that she asked was, how do we become co-conspirators in each other's liberation? I loved that question. So I want to close out my slides with this question for all of us to be thinking about. How do we become co-conspirators in each other's liberation? So we are happy now to take questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Nicole, for that. I have a journal full of notes right now. And to be honest, I am also holding back some tears because some of this information hit very deeply. Thank you for sharing the arc of rioting and not just this sort of one-off moment of rioting. Thank you for that. And thank you for the questions that you asked us to consider. Considering, I'm sure all of us have had recent conversations about rioting and the destruction of community and why would we do that, that sort of thing. So thank you for that. I don't have any questions in the Q&A right now. So if you want to put them in the chat, I will look there as well. So please feel free. But I did notice in the chat, there was one question that came up as you were presenting, Nicole. And as you were talking, you talked about our, and then you talked about occupational groups. And someone wants to know, who is the our you're referring to, and who is the occupational group you're referring to?
Mm-hmm. So it's funny that while I was looking at that quote, I was also trying to recall the our and the occupational group. So I do know for sure that the our in this, can everybody hear me? I'm just making sure.
Yes.
The our in this regard are those of us that are gathered right now, right? The our is the universal that I believe in, right? Because I think that as we all kind of come to the table and grapple with the substance of the riot, the substance of virtue and what constitutes a good person, I think we all kind of have a starting point, right? I think about the difference between embedded theologies and faith versus deliberative ones, right? So the embedded theological is that which we were kind of cultivated with. It's the faith of our mothers, our fathers. It was given to us by the communities of origin. And then deliberative theology or deliberative thinking is that which we kind of wrestle with and come with to our own, right? So I think about even what Sarah and I are doing right now is a work of deliberative reasoning, because there is an extent, and I think this is one thing that I, wanted to sort of chat with Sarah about as we wait for the coffers of Q&A to fill, is to talk about how things have kind of shifted for us in the last, I would say, 5 years since we took this up, right? So our original presentation was with McCormick in 2016. I get the dates wrong, 2016. And then this was published in the Journal of the Society for Christian Ethics. So we've been wrestling with this for 5 years. And I think that we had a particular starting point. And in the year 2020, I think that our vision has kind of been sharpened, right? I can remember having conversations with her in 2016 and 15 when we were conceiving of this, and being able to say something like, I mean, I don't want to condone rioting. Like, there's always this way in which I want to like distance myself. And in 2020, I acknowledged the fact that even that is not a sufficient response, right? Because it means something to use kind of it's not a corollary, but it has helped me in the last year, is even thinking about how we talk about something such as pro-life versus pro-choice, right? So an individual can say, I am pro-life for myself, but pro-choice for everybody else. And even in that, people don't acknowledge that there's kind of a doubling down on a virtue or on a notion of good that says, I'm going to choose what I believe is morally correct for myself, but you all can choose whatever you want, right? There's an implicit bias that works within that. And so I think over the course of the last 5 years, I've been thinking more sharply about the hour. I've been thinking about the necessity of all of us to think differently, to shift our thinking. I think that that question of the co-conspirator is so sharp, because I think for years we've been thinking about the ally. The language of the political ally of standing in solidarity is popular, but the co-conspirator does work. I think, as Sarah lifted for us, the co-conspirator defends space. The co-conspirator uses themselves. One of the things her and I discussed is the mediator between Bree Newsom and the police. So Bree Newsom was able to scale the pole to take down the Confederate flag because a white male stood there and was like, I'm going to get in the way, and I'm going to be the point of sort of disruption between your act of political resistance and my kind of privilege, right? It's a relinquishing of the privilege. It's recognizing that I stand in a particular position that I can throw off for the common good, right? So that's, you know, something that I talked about. So I think the hour is all of us, right? We all have a privilege to throw off so that we can get to what MLK says, talking about that moral arc of the universe bending toward justice, right? It's long and it bends, but it can't bend until all of us relinquish whatever privileges it is that we have. So that is Sarah as a white woman, that's me as a cis hetero person, that's you as, you know, whatever qualify. I think we all have to sort of think deeply about what it means to be co-conspirators in the world, which means like the hour is all of us. That was a very long way of answering that question.
But thank you for that. And you did give time for the coffers of the Q&A to be filled. So a question that has come through, and I would like to get back to at some point, Sarah, how you've struggled or how you've worked through some of this information in the last few years, 5 years, or even within the last 3 months, how you've done that. But I want to go to this question that's in our Q&A. What should we do prior to rioting, perhaps to prevent it from succumbing to instigation by oppressors? And how can we make the most of a riot when it happens?
Oh, wow.
Deep question.
Yeah. So I appreciate the framing of this question as what should we be doing before the moments of rioting? Because one of the things that Nicole and I were talking about, and I think I'm recalling what you were saying, Nicole, that kind of what we want is not, we want conditions in which rioting is not necessary. That if we were responding already in other ways, the riots might never happen. The riots are always in response to injustice and violence. And that's what I especially appreciate about Carol Anderson's work, that she's calling our attention away from the moment of rioting and to, well, let's look at the legislation, the Supreme Court decisions, the governmental bureaucracy, the national policies, all that has been piling up for decades and now centuries, that is bringing us to a moment where it is reasonable to be full of rage and seems unreasonable to not be. So in terms of like, what could we be doing differently? I definitely think political action, civic activism, because some of what needs to be done differently, of course, is different policies. I mean, I think I would repeat some of what we're hearing these days, particular calls for change, defunding the police, or in some cases, abolish the police, put resources toward education, healthcare, mental health care, social work, change who is getting called in moments of need. Why is it that the police are the ones responding? So the kind of work, and this is often very grassroots local activism to change municipal budgets and funding priorities, to change the kinds of policies at the local level. And of course, it's also very important at the state level, the national level. But again, to really pay attention to what is going on within our local communities. And how can we be working towards budgets and policies that prioritize what is life-giving. And think back to like all your wonderful responses about what constitutes a good life, and think about, okay, so how all those factors of a good life, from meaningful work to access to basic necessities and resources, how do we make that happen for our communities?
And I also think something Sarah and I discussed in regard to how, like, what do we do before the riot, is that it's also about individual responsibility, right? So I think that there is a way in which, I absolutely think that the grassroots actions that Sarah is, advocating we all participate in are key and important, right? Even thinking about what some of us may have heard Angela Davis say about how we vote in November, and that vote being about voting for Biden as thinking about us being able to pressure and push him into listening to mass demands, right? And I think that those kind of actions are important, but I think on an individual level of responsibility, I think it is, and this is simple and complex at the same time, it has to do with waking up in the morning and asking of yourself, what must I do today to ensure someone else's freedom, right? It's rooted in the question that I posed to Sarah about how can we be co-conspirators in each other's liberation, right? It's about literally waking up every morning, understanding the position of privilege that all of us operate in a sense, right? To differing degrees, right? But what do you do when you wake up in the morning and you wonder, what must I do to secure someone else's freedom? Does that, it might mean, obviously, you're participating in grassroots actions. It might mean that you're going out and making sure that a person that is without a home has a meal. It might mean that you're donating to a bail fund, like you're constantly in the service of thinking about how you use sort of I like to talk about like relative freedoms, how you use the relative freedom that you have to secure the freedom of another individual. And that requires a lot of it, right? If you even think about this pandemic, we're in the midst of two pandemics right now. If you think about how we're watching the world react to COVID-19 and this division between wearing a mask and not wearing a mask. Wearing a mask is enacting a practice that secures the liberation or the life of another individual. When you wear a mask and you go out because you have to go grocery shopping or you have to, I don't know what you have to do, but when you wear that mask, that is a simple sign that you are caught up in the freedom of another human being. When you don't wear the mask, that is a sign that the only person that you believe you are responsible for in the moment is yourself. But, as a colleague, my colleague Sherry Madkins, who is also doing her PhD work at Emory, she brought up how close this analogy is between the virus of COVID-19 and racism. Like, it's such a close corollary that we have to think about the ways in which we participate or the ways in which we turn a blind eye because we say it's not hitting close to home. So I don't have to wear a mask. I don't have to do anything. No, you do, because we are all intimately connected to one another. We are all interdependent beings that are caught up in a neoliberal system that suggests that all that matters is the person you see right here. All that matters is Nicole and her big forehead right here. No, all that matters is everybody I see in this Zoom, everybody that I don't see, every person that I see as I pass the grocery aisles of Publix. We are interconnected. And so every morning when we get up, our prayer should be not only the prayer that we have on our knees, but the one that we do on our feet is, what must I do personally to secure somebody else's freedom?
Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you both for that. And one of the things that I want to transition to is around the language. We talk about riots, and what we've seen lately is, there's riots, and then now people are making sure they say peaceful protest or peaceful march. And so the next question is phrased like this: I perceive that in the days following the initial uprising, many protests and marches emphasize the peaceful part when inviting people to join them. Do you feel like that doubling down on peaceful protests is helpful or harmful to the language of rioting? I see you shaking your head.
I think I worry that what's going on is the emphasis becomes on peaceful, which becomes a way to then condemn and write off anything that does not get described as peaceful, that gets labeled as a riot. And to me, what's important is the protest part. And thinking about what is getting protested and what is the change being sought.
Okay.
Yeah.
And to follow up on that, protest by nature, as I understand them, are not they're not peaceful, right? The protest is already about interrupting something. It's about disrupting something. And, you know, I always go back to the quote. What is the quote that, is it peace is not the absence of conflict, but, and I, you know, I don't know the rest, but I think many of you may know what I'm sort of like alluding to, but I always rail against the necessity of trying to double down on like saying it's a peaceful protest, it's a peaceful rally. No, we are at a time where we're trying to gain peace, right? We're trying to create it, but the means by which we're trying to create it are not necessarily steeped in peace. I think it's a misnomer to like insist that you gather people around this notion of peace. And it's a bit of respectability. I think Sarah talks about and thinks about that a little bit. There is a bit of respectability politics involved even in the way that we resist, which is to make sure people think it's peaceful so that even our protests are not interrupted by people, right? If we could say it's peaceful, then it won't be interrupted, when in actuality, we always need to be in the service of disrupting, especially, I think, as Sarah lifted so well for us, thinking about the way that dominant narratives around ethics have been over-determined by sort of Eurocentric white Christian models of virtue that protect white womanhood, that protect white patriarchy. And so I think that it's significant, and this is not to make like Black and lack of peace like synonymous, but it is to say that it's dangerous to depend on and insist on the protest being peaceful when by nature protest as an action is rooted in some lack of peace to begin with.
Yeah. And if I may add just a little bit more, I think also we should pay attention to who is getting to label these protests. And how is that coming about? These are what is considered a peaceful protest, what is considered a riot. These are slippery terms. And remember how Colin Kaepernick was treated when he was kneeling on a football field. And he was not regarded as being engaged in peaceful protest. I have been at demonstrations planned by committed nonviolent activists who have shown up without a weapon in their hands to be met by police and soldiers in full riot gear. And what's going on in that moment? It's not exactly a peaceful protest, but who turned it into a riot? So I also think it's important to be thinking about these slippery terms, who is using them and to what ends.
Yeah, and as I listen to you both, but Sarah, as I listen to you, and I can feel your passion and yours as well, Nicole. So how have you been this information or this work transformed for you over the last few years, as Nicole talked about earlier? But how has it transformed for you, or how have you been sitting with it? this work around rioting is flourishing?
I was trying to figure out who that was for.
No,
I was like,
I'm sorry, that was for Sarah, because I know you answered, you talked about it earlier, so Sarah.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. Sorry.
Okay.
Just wanted to be good and take turns.
Right.
Yeah. So I think already in some of our earlier work, I think some of what I came to was what I just said, this suspicion toward trying to distinguish between, so what's a peaceful protest, what's a riot, who is it who gets to define what's going on. And I think I became a lot more open to the idea of rioting is a form of political resistance. And I am not going to waste my energy on condemning it. I'm going to focus on other things, which is what are the conditions that are prompting people to gather in the streets? What is it that they are angry about? And am I also angry about that? And if I'm not, why not? What am I not seeing? What am I not paying attention to? So I think one of the things that has come over time, not exclusively in relation to our particular work around rioting is flourishing, but I am definitely noticing I'm increasingly angry about what is happening.
Yeah.
And empathetic toward people who are expressing their anger by breaking windows or setting a police car on fire.
Yeah. Thank you. And as we prepare to wrap up, but just thank you so much for the power and passion of your work and your continued personal work with the work, right? And for allowing it to also impact you, and that it's not just a head exercise for you, right? But it's a heart and a community exercise. So thank you so much for that. And as we prepare to wrap up, I just want to ask, how can we continue to delve into this work? Is there a book? I know you talked about Carol Anderson. Is there an article? How do we continue this personal journey to learn these things or to transform ourselves or to see things a bit differently when it comes to writing? And that's for both of you. Whichever one.
Yeah. I feel like I absolutely feel like I'm still thinking. I mean, obviously, I do think that picking up Carol Anderson's book is significant because I do think it's really important to reflect on white rage toward Black progress, right? Because historically, that's been so much of what the response has been. I mean, even thinking about living in Atlanta, Atlanta had its own race riot that was based on a response to Black progress, that white rage enacted it. And so I think it's important to sit with authors such as Carol Anderson, to read womanist work from Katie Cannon and from Tracy West. And I'm thinking about a slew of people, and maybe we can sort of like create a very small bibliography that was helpful to us, because I think that shifting the ethical paradigm about what is normative and what makes for, you know, living the proper life is important in this discussion, right? I think the whole reason we could have this conversation is because we've sort of been steeped and formed by these thinkers. You know, we had to start at Aristotle, and then we had to sort of deconstruct our own views to figure out how exactly do we land. But I also think that it's important to just keep our eyes on what's happening in the world. I don't know, continue to be reflective. I think the one takeaway that I have personally is just thinking about the way in which we all desire to be moral agents, you know, moral agents that are helping the arc of the universe bend toward justice. And in some ways, we try to act really quickly because we feel like we have to respond. We've got to do something quick. But I also think that there's significant power in being able to discern your place in movements and figure out how best you can be of use, because I think everybody has a place, right? We are all part of a body. The body has a lot of different functions. And so we have storytellers, we have thinkers, we've got donors, we have medics, we have all of these different people. And so I think that we just have to tap into what our work is. We have to continually wake up and think about what we are supposed to do, and read and act, read and respond. I think that Marcia Riggs has a great book called Awake, Rise, and Act, I believe. It's something around that. And literally that's a framework for how we should be moving through the world.
Thank you. And so, Sarah, you have any last minute comments?
So my personal takeaway from our conversation today is totally the question you were asking a few minutes ago, Nicole, that inviting us to ask every morning when we wake up, okay, so today, excuse me, today, what am I going to do to help secure someone else's freedom?
Mm-hmm.
Today, what actions can I take to be a co-conspirator in someone else's liberation? Today, what am I going to be doing? I love that emphasis.
Yeah.
And so that is for sure just what I want to lift up. I'll be thinking about that. I would urge all of you to be thinking about it. McCormick as an institution, to keep thinking, what are we doing to secure someone else's liberation?
Thank you so much for this time and for your work. And for the way I'm sure you have inspired many of us. And I'm just going to close with this quote from someone in the chat. She says, "Thank you, Sarah and Nicole. Very powerful message today. And this message has led me to look at protests and riots with a different lens." We all come away from this moment with a different lens and with language and with questions to ask ourselves and to ask the community. So thank you again for joining us. And we hope that you will join us tomorrow, McCormick Theological Seminary, for the Trauma Symposium at 12 noon. Just go to mccormick.edu and register today. So thank you so much. Blessings.